Hello guys, Foxblock here. As mentioned, this is the video in which I play through the initial version of Greyout and talk a bit about my design decisions and what went into the game. The version I will be playing is the one released for the homebrew platformer competition for the Open Pandora a while ago. I might do an update later with the final version of the game, but I will already go into the changes I made to the existing levels in this video. First of all, though, some words of introduction. I'm not the greatest level designer and I don't have a lot of experience. I am only making games for like 3 years now. I just read a lot about it on the internet and watch videos of some better game designers talk about their ideas and decisions, and I try to adopt the concepts they talk about and I see in other games. So you will probably find some holes and errors in my explanations and reasoning, which is the exact point of this video actually. It's to get into some kind of dialogue in which I try to present my knowledge and ideas, and you might take something away from that to improve your own games. Alert me of problems or mistakes I'm making to help me improve, or just see the reasoning behind some design choices I made which seemed stupid when you played the game initially. Lastly, if you have not played the game yet, I suggest you do so before continuing to watch the video, as for one I will obviously spoil all the puzzles, but also I imagine the stuff I say makes more sense after you actually experience the level for yourself. The game is available for Windows, Linux and the Pandora. Download links for that are in the description. So this first level is just about teaching the very basic elements of the game to the player. This includes the player figure, the moveset, boxes, and also the first and only hazard of the game, spikes or red stuff in general. What I like to do is teach this stuff by letting the player experience it and experiment with it for himself and not use static text or non-interactive cutscenes. In the end, experience is the better teacher and kind of burns new knowledge into your brain. Also it helps immersion, as overlays will always drag you out of the game. These first gaps are to show what the player character is capable of, how far and how high he can jump, and also, as you will probably fail at least once on your first try, show that death isn't really a threat, as it will just restart the level. The controls again are drawn into the level portal style, which to me seems a better way than overlays. The last thing in this level is the ability to push boxes and show that you will need them to get around. Also, the exit is shown as the clear goal of the level without actually needing any indication due to the use of a well-known icon. Well, I have to admit the whole layout of the level is adapted from Braid, a game I really like and draw lots of inspiration from. I recommend you play it if you haven't already. As much ideas as I put into this level, it actually failed its job horribly, which is mostly due to the lack of testing, which again is mostly due to the lack of time, which again is mostly due to me not starting early enough before the deadline of the competition. The initial jumps are too hard. You will fail lots of times on your first try, and this is only the first level, so you can see how players become demotivated. Especially the first one over the pit is frustrating, as you have to restart the level yourself, and being forced to do so is destroying motivation much more than failing to some immediately hazardous obstacles. I was trying to teach the restart combo to the player, but now I don't think it's actually necessary to force that. Just let the player know it's there and move on. Overall, I think in games like this you should make the first level or first few levels unfailable to encourage the player to go on and don't demotivate him from the start. You can still ramp up the difficulty curve later on, just let the player safely experiment and get familiar with the game at the start. A good example for this would be Super Meat Boy, in which the first level you can actually die on is the third one, though the first level putting hazards directly in your way is only the sixth one. So here's the current version of the level, and as you can see there's no way to lose this one. The spikes are gone, the pit is gone, and even the area around the crate got slightly updated, so you can't put yourself in a dead end there, which was possible before, although not too obvious. The purpose of the level is the same, except for dying. It still teaches the exact same mechanics, just gives the player more room to experiment and is not as discouraging. Additionally, the level got stretched a bit so it does not feel as cramped, and I decreased the speed you push crates with so they feel heavier. The idea behind the second level in this version of Greyout is just to teach the concept of what I call wrapping to the player. aka the ability to move like Pac-Man from one end of the level to the other. This concept is very important in the game and not very obvious, so I figured it needs to be taught extra intense, in the way that at first you don't know what to do in this level, but then hopefully get an aha moment sooner or later. So the starting area leaves only one way to go, followed up by a seemingly impossible jump. The death pit in the middle is of no real harm, and there are no other elements to interact with around. If the player is paying attention, he might notice the black box at the very top wrapping around, or the red block falling down over and over, indicating that the player might be able to do the same. This is the first and most important step, with the rest of the level consisting of a few jumps and no other puzzles. Basically just the wrapping mechanic in action with increasing difficulty. As a side note, the final part of the level can even be tackled in two different ways, and while it's only a minor thing here, in general non-linearity is a thing I like to see in puzzles very much. This level was a brick wall to most players. It was way too hard, not only to figure out, but also to execute, which is even worse, as that should be the fun and rather easy part. I tried to maintain some variety in the game by putting jump challenges next to puzzles, but you really shouldn't do that right after teaching a new mechanic. As I said before, let the player safely experiment first. On difficulty, as a rule of thumb, if you think your game is too easy, it's probably too hard. If you think it's hard, it's definitely way too hard. You will only find the sweet spot by experience and testing a lot. I will include a good video on that topic by Chris Hacker in the description. Then, aha moments are a great thing to happen in a puzzle game, but you cannot force them like I did here. Just don't try too hard. Those need to happen naturally and will if a puzzle game is well built and the player messes around and has fun with the game mechanics. Don't overly obscure puzzles like this, especially on the second level. Players won't be paying attention to small details and probably won't get what you are trying to get across. If something is important, make it obvious. Save the subtlety for expert stuff. The third level is an extension to the second one, as it introduces vertical wrapping and presents a rather simple puzzle to bring the mechanic into action. It is split into two parts, with the first part being introduction to the mechanic and the second one being the actual puzzle. The first part presents an impossible to solve situation to the player if it weren't for the concept of wrapping. You have several blocks going up and some going down, somewhat like an elevator. Now the player has to get to a higher elevation and then back to a lower. This would not be possible without wrapping, especially the third elevator would be impossible to traverse. With the way the level is set up, the player has to wrap around vertically at least once. The mechanic is introduced naturally, or shoved into the player's face, you could say. Also without much harm, as one cannot die on the third elevator. That way the player cannot skip past the mechanic and has some room and time to explore and fully realize it before being introduced to a puzzle. Another thing the player should note is the fact that the elevator blocks are not being destroyed by red stuff, like pusher blocks are, which could happen in the second level for example. This difference becomes important in the second part of the level, the actual puzzle. Firstly, the player sees the exit at the top and a hole in the floor, so one probably tries to reach it by wrapping around, which does not work. Next is the structure to the very right, which seems useless as it's just an elevator leading up to some platform, but as it's the only thing there, the player probably explores it next and notices the single block is actually pushable. Now all pieces of the puzzle were introduced and the player just has to figure out that one has to push the block to the left into the hole to elevate the platform, allowing one to exit. As you can already see, this level served as a much better introduction to wrapping than level 2 and overall is a much better level in general. I don't see much wrong with this level actually. It's less hindered by its design than it is by the limitations of the engine and collision detection, which screw up sometimes due to the low frame rate. As with the second level, some parts of this can be solved in multiple ways. For example, the second elevator can be passed by jumping over the red block or wrapping around, with the latter one being the easier and faster way. The puzzle part involves some timing, which is the biggest downside to this version of the puzzle, as the window of opportunity is way too narrow considering this being the first actual puzzle. The reason for this is that back then the game only allowed non-controller objects to move at a constant speed. You could not make them stop and change direction, or wait for a while. This was only added later. So this more recent version solved that by making the puzzle elevator only stop at the useful levels and wait for a while in between to give the player enough time to act. Additionally, like the first level, I stretched this one a bit as it feels a tad too narrow. Now the separation between the two parts is more noticeable and you only have one on the screen at a time. Finally, here's a bug of the collision engine which is not frustrating for a change. If you jump at the ledge at the correct height, you gain a lot of momentum and run at speed you cannot normally attain. This is even present in the current version of the game, as I never bothered to fix it and actually found it to be a quite funny gimmick. By the way, did you notice this level had a white background outside the actual level area, while the ones before and all the coming ones had a black one? To sum up the most important bits. Introduce elements one at a time. Give the player room to explore the mechanic, don't immediately throw hazards at him. Hint at vital gameplay elements, especially at the beginning of the game. Do it with the next point though, don't use pop-up dialogues. Design your levels around the mechanic. Try to fully explore your core mechanic. Think of how introducing the mechanic changed the rules of the real world or a typical game. Think of implicit challenges and exceptions to the new rule set. Think of interesting combinations and variations of your elements. In the case of Greyout, the change is that there is an inverted world inside of matter, and actually what's matter and what's air or free space is dependent on the point of view. So I want to explore how pushing a block in one world can create a passage in the other, but also how destroying a barricade in one destroys a path in the other. In the case of Braid, this was time manipulation. Implicit questions were, what if certain objects aren't affected by the manipulation, or what if time is directly related to position or movement? Don't try to force revelations. If the player has fun with your game and starts to experiment, he will eventually get there on his own, and that's even more rewarding at the same time. Question every little detail. If something has no use or purpose in the game, maybe you should get rid of it. Think about why you want the player to be able to move like he does, what kind of monsters he fights, if any, how he looks, why the cannon is in that exact spot, etc. But most important of all, if you feel overwhelmed, disregard all this advice and just start to make a game really. Well guys, that's it for now. I will go over the other levels when I find the time to do so. Thanks a lot for watching, and please leave a comment on what I said in the video or the video itself or my commentary or anything else basically. Cheers!